It's great to be back and great to be out of D.C. This panel should be a special treat. As you may have seen, Common Sense is not the only ones to have held a summit on the future of kids this past week. On Thursday, the White House invited a large group of school kids to bring their school desks, sit behind the president, and sign along as he signed the executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. A lot of people were horrified. My reaction was, they're finally showing us the Schoolhouse Rock episodes that PBS has been hiding all these years. When we were kids, we learned how a bill becomes a law, but now it turns out that if another president comes along and he doesn't like that law, he and a group of grade schoolers can just sign an executive order to overturn it. We're very fortunate today to have a perfect panel for the occasion. Two former secretaries of education. Unfortunately, Governor Patrick wasn't able to make it, and we decided not to try for a third former, because it's good that Linda McMahon is still on the job. She's a good person. But these two are a perfect pair. Great secretaries of education, a Republican and a Democrat, both appointed by presidents who were determined to do everything in their power to improve educational outcomes and to strengthen the Department of Education. Margaret Spellings has a special place in my heart. When she came into the White House as President Bush's domestic policy advisor, she took my place, and so I had the honor of carrying on a time-honored tradition among domestic policy advisors of leaving behind a bottle of scotch, which was a tradition that was started by John Ehrlichman, who people forget this, but he was domestic policy advisor and then had to leave the White House to go to prison.
Yeah.
So we've avoided that. One of our successors got arrested for shoplifting. But
yes, at Target.
Small thing.
That's another story.
So
it's a lot of our friends.
And President Bush, who she'd worked for as a governor, came in determined to improve educational outcomes. Margaret led the fight for national legislation to give the Education Department the power it needed to make that happen. And John King is a very special guy, a hero in this field. Has dedicated his entire life to this. He was president of the Education Trust, which kind of really led the fight to close the achievement gap. He became education commissioner of New York State, then deputy education secretary, and eventually secretary of education at the federal level. And is now back in New York as chancellor of SUNY with 64 campuses to oversee. So I'd love to get your reactions. Margaret, maybe we start with you. After so many education presidents, how did we get to this point? And what is the president doing? Why is he doing it?
Well, we took our eye off the ball is the short answer, and I know John feels this way. I think we were both proud to work with two presidents who, whether you loved them or hated them, they used the bully pulpit of the presidency to lead on these issues. And this is a little, you don't have to take my word for it, but from 2000 to 2015, the entirety of the Bush administration, the Obama administration, we were going in the right direction because we had a federal role that was, yes, a little more muscular, but discreet, and had common ground around the thesis that we really, really, really believed that every child should have an opportunity and every child could be successful. And that was our clarion call. And we were going like this. And then for the last 10 years or so, we have, yes, COVID, but the slide and the decline started before that. So we were proud, I know, to work with two presidents who thought that this was an imperative for our country, and they used that role to, elevate the conversation. I have in my office a thing, No Child Left Behind passed the Senate 87-10. You'll remember, because we were all part of the equation, and it was carried on. So that consistency mattered a lot. How did we get here? We took our eye off the ball somehow, and frankly are taking the eye off the ball as if it's against the law to improve student achievement in states unless we get the federal government out of your business. This sending loans to the Small Business Administration and IDEA to HHS, that is the most urgent crisis. The most urgent crisis is we're forgetting about kids and achievement and transparency and accountability and measurement. And obviously, I'm very concerned about it. I'm trying to be a polite Bush Republican about the whole matter and say, I've got a lot of questions. And my first question is, WTF?
John, what should we do about it?
Well, as always, I strongly agree with everything Margaret said. I guess the two things I would add, one is what President Trump is trying to do is against the law. And so that will need to get sorted out by the courts. There is a very clear role for the Education Department in statute. Congress appropriated funds to the Education Department to help vulnerable students, low-income students, students with disabilities, to manage the student aid system. And so that's all in the law. So to your point, Bruce, about Schoolhouse Rock, you can't, with an executive order, dismantle the Education Department. And so this will get sorted out in the courts and in Congress. But what's most sad is two things. One, the federal role has a civil rights history. Yes. And the federal role in education really, the muscular federal role traces back to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, right, when Title I began. And that law was necessary because states and districts weren't serving students well. You think back to that famous Norman Rockwell painting of Ruby Bridges integrating schools in New Orleans. Right? You see little Ruby Bridges escorted by federal marshals because the state and district didn't want to serve Ruby Bridges, and the federal government needed to intervene. That is still true. There are still places where students of color do not have adequate access to advanced placement classes. There are still places where students with disabilities are not getting the services they are entitled to. And the federal government's job is to intervene, and that is being undermined. Many of the people who do that work were laid off last week. So that's one thing that is incredibly sad, is the loss of that important civil rights role. But the other thing, to build on Margaret's point, is we should have our hair on fire about where our student performance is right now. Student performance is below where it was before COVID. Right? We have millions of young people who are not on track for success in college and careers. And instead of talking about that, we're talking about the dismantling of the Education Department. So the opportunity cost of this moment is very high.
Yeah, well said. So do you think this is on the level? Are they really going to follow through with it? I mean, 2/3 of the American people oppose this. I think if I were president, I'd be grateful that I didn't have the authority to do this.
Right.
And, it's been out there for a while. Like Ronald Reagan looked at it, and then his Secretary of Education did the Nation at Risk report, which said that if an unfriendly foreign power had imposed the kind of mediocre educational performance we have as a country, we'd declare it an act of war. Now unfriendly foreign powers are Canada. So, and it used to be like, I mean, this was a great trivia question. Like, what are the three departments that Bush's successor Rick Perry, as governor, when he ran for president, what are the three federal departments that he proposed to eliminate, and which was the one that he forgot for 15 minutes in a national presidential debate? Yeah. The one he forgot was energy, which Trump then appointed him to become secretary. So is it on the level?
I just bet John a pitcher of margaritas that at the end of the year that the Department of Education would still be standing because there are not 60 votes in the Senate to do this, and it can't be done through reconciliation. They can certainly move things around, and they can certainly do things up with the checkbook. But the thing that I'm most worried about is, because it's small money, is the data, the research, iPads, IES, NAEP, all the things. Jim, I took a photo, I did get my phone out, of your action plan for kids. Every single one of those things is a measurable goal. And if we don't have the data, I like to say we got to care enough to find out. And I know I'm a hawk on this stuff, but this lack of data is going to be used to kill this imperative and this urgency around kids. Because if we don't have a problem, we don't need to solve it. We don't need federal money for it. We can give the governors and do choice or whatever you want to do. So for all the folks who were nervous about data, I'm talking unions and so forth, this is the time for us to stand up for this, because if there's no imperative as a civil rights matter, as you rightly say, John, we don't need a solution. We don't need a federal mandate. We don't need resources. That's the end.
And John, what are the impacts at the state and local level in the meantime? What harms are you seeing, including on the higher ed side, which is a big part of the education department's?
The biggest.
Yeah. Look, last week the FAFSA went down. And when the FAFSA went down, that's the free application for federal student aid. It's the way that students get Pell Grants and access the student financial aid system. When it went down, they called the people whose job it was to fix it, and they weren't there because they were laid off. And it took them longer to fix than it should have. They got it fixed, thank goodness. But I'm worried we're going to see more of that. It's already a fragile system, under-resourced and understaffed. But if the FAFSA doesn't work, if the student aid system doesn't work, students will not come to college. At the State University of New York, almost half of our entering students are Pell-eligible students. That federal financial aid makes it possible for them to pursue the American dream. If that system breaks down, you're talking about students sometimes first in their family to go to college. Sometimes their parents don't speak English. A strong breeze is enough to knock them off course.
Yep.
And so if the financial aid system doesn't work, students will get discouraged. They won't come. That will be bad for higher ed, bad for the country, bad for the economy, bad for our national security. So I'm very worried about that. And I'm worried about people not having someplace to go when harm is done to them. If you're a parent of a kid with a disability and you've been trying to get services and you can't get them, eventually you have the option to go to the Office for Civil Rights and file a complaint. Now, they had over 20,000 complaints last year. Who's going to respond to that? They laid off the folks whose job is to respond to that, so people will be left without that resource. Think about some of the progress we've made. Think about Title IX and women's sports today. That's partly made possible by vigorous enforcement of Title IX. But we're losing that in losing the department.
I mean, the federal government has been a backstop, but for the reasons, the legacy reasons that John started out with. And if I had a nickel for every superintendent or university president or chief state school officers that said, thank God for No Child Left Behind, or thank God for whatever, because we couldn't have done that ourselves. The federal government has to be the backstop on these critical things.
To come back to the achievement gap, which you've both dedicated your lives to trying to close, we lost a lot of ground in the pandemic. It appears that we're losing more. The latest NAEP scores for 4th and 8th graders were down even further. What's going on? What can we do about it? What states or districts are doing things that stand out?
You want me to start?
Sure.
Well, I mean, because of the data, we can answer that question. And when we look at Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, 3 places that you wouldn't necessarily pull out of a hat and say, oh, I bet they're killing it on reading. They're making really good progress for a couple reasons why they're out of denial about it. They have to be. And they have really focused on research-based reading instruction and have implemented it with fidelity. and are seeing some good near-term results. A lot of places have implemented that kind of legislation, but for whatever reason, it's not well implemented in the field. Texas has a good law. They haven't had particularly good results. So I think a real focus around reading, which is one of the things on the plan, and I think that's encouraging. And so if this is the era of local control, and I think it is, with or without the Department of Education, we're going to see more authority for states and local districts. And how do we think about making that, the forum here? But those are encouraging things. What's going wrong is, and I fear this idea that we really, as a nation, don't believe, and this is why presidential leadership is so important, in the prospect and the opportunity for every single kid.
That's great. John, same question to you. What signs of hope do you see out there?
Can I say some
Sure.
depressing things first? Just to build on Margaret's points, I do think we have to be honest that chronic absenteeism is out of control.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kids are missing a lot of school. Yep. And I would say even the best teacher can't be successful with the kid who isn't in class. And we have a culture problem around school attendance. There are a lot of factors driving it, some factors in kids' home lives and community lives, but also some things that schools haven't done a very good job of, making school a place that is compelling and engaging and interesting so the high school student wants to be there. We have to get kids in school more. And then very relevant to the work of Common Sense, I do think technology is getting in the way of student learning. I'm really proud that our governor in New York, Governor Hochul, has proposed a bell-to-bell ban on cell phones. I think that is the right thing to do. There are so many distractions for kids, and it is undermining their ability not only to learn, but to concentrate. And that, I think, is very dangerous. So those are sort of two depressing things that are happening that we should be very worried about. On a more optimistic note, and we know this because of the data and the research, intensive, high-quality tutoring can help students make very rapid progress. But it has to be well-designed. The tutor has to be well-trained. The relationship has to be intensive and consistent. The quality of materials before the student and the tutor have to be good. And if you have those ingredients, you actually see students making great progress. And we've seen it in very rigorous studies, that parallel studies that would be done for drug treatments, right? Very strong evidence of effectiveness. But we have to go and learn from the places that are doing it right. And without the data, we'll have less ability to do that. Another thing that's very promising that we're seeing is a high-quality career and technical education. Again, when it's well done, where students are getting real hands-on learning that is tied to the world of work in a way that gets them excited about the skills they're gaining, that can be very effective. But again, we're going to need research on where does it work best and under what conditions, with what training, with what support, with what accountability. And without the department, we'll have less of that evidence.
Thank you. We've just got a couple minutes left. Margaret, but ask you the same question. What should we be doing about tech in schools?
Well, I mean, I think, and we're seeing it, and it is a bipartisan kind of issue, this idea that, kids don't need phones with them 24 hours a day. None of us do. So I'm encouraged about that. But I know you're working on this at Common Sense, so a little shout out to you. But look, I'm an old dog here and maybe a dinosaur. There is no substitute for teaching a kid to read. So we're woefully short of doing that right now. And, a lot of people, because nobody knows the answer, and things are being discovered in the private sector and the public sector and all over the place about AI. But let's just commit to teach kids to read, and then when y'all are ready to tell us what to do about AI, we'll embrace it, and we'll be able to read the manual.
That's great. Well, we're out of time, but let's thank these two great public servants for decades of what they've done.